Welcome back, Rob Katiris. Welcome back to Sentimental Elephants, a musical journey, where I take you through the alphabet, letter by letter, introduce you an artist associated with each letter, and talk about my own personal musical experience with them, how I got into their music, and what their music means to me, with a little bit of music history thrown in. Nice to see you again. It has been a couple of weeks. I might switch to a bi-weekly schedule. I'm not sure. Quality, I guess, is better than quantity. So yeah, we're now N. Nice to see you, as in N. We have reached the letter N. We're past the midway point for the alphabet, and so letter N. N starts. N is for Nirvana. Obviously, a classic band. God help me. Actually, no, not this T-shirt, but I actually had a T-shirt up until relatively recently. It was a Nirvana shirt, and I had it when the band was still around, when Kurt Cobain was still with us, and it's like I was still wearing it up until not that long ago. Like, weird to think of them as a classic band, because I remember their, I can't really say I remember their first album coming out, but I remember their second one. Definitely remember when Nevermind broke big, another N. So yeah, Nirvana. We also have Nine Inch Nails, Rock and Roll Hall of Famers. The National, or excellent band. I got to see them live last year. Yes, again, another band I've seen live. But that was one of the best shows I've ever seen. It was really, really, a really heart-stirring show. Laura Nyro was a wonderful, wonderful singer-songwriter. Sadly unappreciated, but I talk her up to anyone I can at any chance I get. The Nice, which was a progressive rock band from pretty much the late 60s. It's kind of before there was really progressive rock, but 60s and 70s, noted for having Keith Emerson, later from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Bill Nelson, amazing guitar player, musician, solo artist in his own right, but I know him through Bebop Deluxe. Willie Nelson, different from Bill Nelson, the country music legend. Willie Nile, again another artist altogether, not to be confused with Willie Nelson, but great musician and songwriter. And again, I got to see him live a number of years ago. Neutral Milk Hotel, Nova Mob, R.I.P. Grant Hart. Really miss him. I don't think he ever really got his due as a songwriter. Heather Nova, again, talking about a lot of songwriters today. It fits given who I will be talking about in this video, but Heather Nova is another wonderful singer-songwriter. The Northern Pikes, great Canadian band, and fitting who we will be talking about, the legendary Randy Newman, and who we are talking about today, which would be Nilsson, Harry Nilsson. Going to be doing a little bit differently this time out. We'll be doing sort of in reverse order. Usually I'll quickly go over the history and then talk more at length about my own particular journey with the artist. But I'll actually be starting with a journey. It's a little bit shorter talking about that, but I do want to delve into talking about Mr. Nilsson's career, because I find it fascinating. I think it's one of the most interesting, unusual career paths in music history. I guess my first real awareness of Harry Nilsson was just his name coming up in the not particularly good TV movie from the earlier mid 80s. I forget what it was, but John and Yoko: A Love Story, which told the story of John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and Harry Nilsson shows up as a friend and drinking buddy of John Lennon's. He was kind of just one of those guys. I for whatever reason, I didn't really pay attention to him. I mean, and I knew that he was an artist, but I didn't really think too much about him, and I never had any particular curiosity about him. I remember my ex-wife saying that he had a beautiful voice, which I hadn't noticed at the time, and I will talk about in a bit. But it just seemed kind of one of those sort of, I don't know. I said, oh yeah, okay, he's it's kind of quirky, eccentric left field kind of songwriter. So I feel kind of odd that I didn't pursue him any further at the time, because he, that's quite frankly the sort of person I rather like. Tom Waits springs to mind. Big favorite of mine, but I didn't I didn't to think, and for some reason, it sort of it kind of built up a bit at a time in my consciousness, frequently through covers or showing up in other media. I guess the really noticed when Amy Mann. Um, I associated with the soundtrack to the movie Magnolia, but it turns out it was actually originally done as part of a Harry Nilsson tribute album. But she covered, what did she cover? She covered one, which we'll talk about, and we will talk about. But that was a great version of that song. And I was the song Coconut. You put the lime in the coconut, you drink it all up. That shows up, of course, at the end of Reservoir Dogs, and I don't really think of myself as a Tarantino guy, and yet I've watched all of his movies multiple times because I do enjoy them. But yeah, that's remember that song coming up in that right at the end of the movie. A little bit more recently, I didn't quite catch on at the time, but with the Netflix, at least the first season of the Netflix series Russian Doll, the song "Gotta Get Up," gotta get up, gotta get right, got until the morning comes. I'm sorry, I'm making a hash of the lyrics. I don't really remember all of them, but that's sort of the theme song. At least the song does show up a number of times in that series at very important points. And I thought this was like a current contemporary singer songwriter, and it turns out that it was Harry Nilsson did it in the early '70s. It's like, oh wow, it's like very timeless song. I think, but I definitely enjoy that. Um, it's kind of built up over time, and I was at my local used music emporium, Turning Point, spotted a best of Harry Nilsson compilation. And got that, and wow, there's a lot of good stuff that I enjoyed on it. And I was like, oh yeah, this is pretty cool. And as I've mentioned before, during the lockdown and working a lot of overtime, and this is coming up on one of these websites I probably shouldn't pay attention to if I want to pay closer attention to my spending habits. Said, hey, there's a complete works of or at least the complete. Was it RCA Victor? I think that was it. Let's have a look. It's right in front of me. The RCA albums collection. Box set of all of the albums that Harry Nilsson did during that time, along with lots of extra stuff. And I'm a sucker for extra stuff. So I snapped it up and I listened to it, and this immediately became the stuff of life for me. I was being fascinated by it. Also, in that category was me discovering a documentary. I'll bring this up later, but hopefully there's not too much glare. Who is Harry Nilsson? Who is Harry Nilsson, and why is everybody talking about it? And if I find a music documentary that I really like, I'll watch it a lot. I'll watch it over and over again, and by golly, I did it with that one. So I'll touch on that one a bit later when we go over his career. But that just brought in the consciousness, and all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, now Harry Nilsson's absolutely one of my favorite people. His favorite singers, songwriters, artists. So I'm going to delve now into a bit of his career path. I've mentioned before, it's one of the unique, very odd career path that he had. The most successful songs, probably the most successful songs that he wrote, were actually hits for other people. I don't know how big a hit it was, but he did a song called "Cuddly Toy," which was done by the Monkees. And that kind of got him started. I'm not the only cuddly toy that was ever enjoyed. No, sorry, you're not the only cuddly toy that was ever enjoyed by any boy. A little dark song, actually. I kind of was a little surprised that something as kind of as clean cut as the Monkees were at the time and cover that. But it was got him a paycheck. But probably the biggest. Most successful song that I don't know if you can say he's known for it, but his biggest, one of his, possibly his biggest song, which was One. One is the loneliest number you'll ever do. Two could be as bad as one. It's the loneliest number since the number one. And I think that was actually a number one's hit, not for Harry Nilsson, but for Three Dog Night. Three Dog Night's version, Harry Nilsson, I'll probably lean a little more towards his. It was a bit more subtle, low key. That's it. The Three Dog Night version is amazing. It's very wide open, and Chuck Negron has something very powerful vocal to it. That's probably his most famous song that he wrote. Now, kind of the most famous songs that he recorded, again, is like his famous songs that he wrote or hits for other people. The famous songs that he recorded were covers of other songs. Everybody's Talking, which was a part of the soundtrack for the movie Midnight Cowboy. Everybody's talking at me. I don't hear a word they're saying. Only the echoes of my mind. Which was a song written by the singer-songwriter Harry Neal. Harry Neal? Fred Neal. Sorry. Get the names mixed up. But that was a pretty substantial hit. I'm not sure if he won an Oscar for that. Might have won a Grammy. But yeah, that was was first really huge hit, and probably the bit maybe besides Coconut, but probably the biggest song that he ever recorded was the song Without You, which was originally done by one of my favorite bands, Badfinger. And it's his version is probably the definitive version. I know it was a big hit for Mariah Carey later on, and it's pretty much a standard at this point. A lot of people have recorded it or recovered from recording it, but for me, Harry Nilsson's version is definitive. It's got that glorious vocal take on it. I can't live if living is without you, and I'll say that his version is probably. No, I think it's definitely better than the original. Much though I love Badfinger, I think they would have conceded that he brought something a bit extra to it. The original version is a little slower. I think a little bit of a problem is that Tom Morgan, I think, the bass player who wrote the chorus, because it was written by the late Pete Ham and himself. They both passed away. But the bass player wrote the chorus, and it's kind of straining the top of his range, whereas Harry Nilsson took it. Harry Nilsson had incredible range and just soared with that chorus. So I would have to give his version as being the definitive one. I mentioned before probably the best known song that he wrote and he sang was Coconut, which is kind of a novelty song, and it's a bit silly, but it's a fun little song. I think it comes up in the documentary how it was the producer, Richard Perry, who's a great producer, worked with a lot of people showing up in documentaries I've watched. He worked with Fanny, and he also, I think most notably, worked with Carly Simon, but he was the one who made the suggestion of doing different voices for each of kind of the characters of the song. So it was the doctor coming in with the deep voice. So let me get this straight. And that was a really nice touch. Which you do think really made the song kind of sparkle, get out a bit of unique kind of whimsy to it. There's a lot of whimsy to his material. And so that's sort of, I guess, the most famous song he wrote and sang. Another song, much later on that I discovered was him. I kind of pieced together. I mostly knew this song through little parodies, but he did a song called My Best Friend. People, let me tell you about my best friend. He's a warm-hearted person who loves me to the end. And that was the theme song for a TV series called The Courtship of Eddie's Father, which is a little family-oriented sitcom from the late 60s, early 70s. Bill Bixby, later from The Hulk, played a widower who had a young son named Eddie, and Eddie was always trying to match him up with different women to be, because his new mother and ex-wife, based on whether or not Eddie liked them. I also remember that they, had a housekeeper who's a Japanese American woman named Mrs. Livingston, who always addressed Bill Bixby's character as Mr. Eddie's father, and I'm still trying to figure out how it is that I have direct knowledge of this show, because I looked it up. It's like, okay, the show ended in 1971. I was born in 1970, but I do remember seeing it. But I guess it went on in reruns for quite some time. But yeah, this I don't know if it hold up today, but I remember it was a sweet show. So yes, Harry Nilsson did a song that was the theme song for that, and I guess got brought back to mind when there was a parody of it done on an episode of South Park, and it's just one of those songs that shows up every once in a while. It's kind kind of a sweet little classic song. Let's see. Okay, so his life. He was born in 1941. His father left quite early. Much of this is he addresses in a song. I think it was on his first album called appropriately 1941. And his mother was raising him on his own, and sometimes he was living with some other relatives. They were poor. It was like kind of rough circumstances, but he kind of developed a love for music and for entertaining. Although oddly, I don't see it in my notes here. I'll just bring up the strange thing about his career is that he never performed concerts. He did not perform in front of audiences until once he started his recording career. He did a little bit early on, but I guess it was not good circumstances for him. Wasn't a good experience, but. So once he started making his albums, he didn't really do any concerts after that. He was actually working for a bank. He was working in a computer center. I work for a bank, but I don't work in a computer center. So maybe that's why a little bit of kinship with the gentleman. But he was working there, and that's when he was discovered. He was got a recording contract as a songwriter, but. That's where he sold a song for the Monkees, and that's where he started making his own albums. He released 3 wonderful little albums. I think it was Pandemonium Shadow Show, and then came Aerial Ballet, and then Harry, and they had these wonderful whimsical songs on it, and a lot of depth. It's great. Those are great albums. Odd little note I have written here. He did some songs for soundtrack for a movie called Skidoo, which was, I gather, it was just by the director Otto Preminger. I gather not a successful song, a movie rather. I first remember reading about it in a book called, and it was the worst movies ever. But it's kind of a little old Hollywood establishment's take on 60s culture at the time. But Harry had a small part in one. Kind of odd little note about it. He did the closing music, which was him singing the closing credits, like all of them, like every I think I don't know if Gaffer and Best Boy came in, but there's is a song called Cast and Crew. As just one of those odd little details I kind of enjoy. Another notable detail is that his early albums got noticed by Derek Taylor, who was the publicist for the Beatles, and he brought his albums back to England and started playing them for the Beatles, and all of a sudden he's getting attention, getting praise from the biggest band in the world. He was friends with John Lennon for quite some time. He was best friends with Ringo Starr. Ringo, pardon me, was the best man at his wedding, his third wedding, but. He was very good friends with the Beatles, and the Beatles just loved him and his music. At one point, I think it was John Lennon said, "Yeah, our favorite American group is Nilsson," and so nice little feather in his cap because he very much loved the Beatles, and he did some covers of their songs, and the Beatles' influence would show up. After those first 3, he kind of went through some kind of neat little tangents. He did an album called Nilsson Sings Newman, which was, right when he's full flower as an own songwriter. He's doing this tribute to this, at this point, still emerging American songwriter, Randy Newman. Randy Newman played piano on this album, where Harry Nilsson sang all the vocals. And, so I think Randy Newman was quite taken by how generous he was with the praise and getting this sort of exposure. He also did this album called The Point, and I'm going to show you this here. This isn't the album; it's the movie animated, or was it animated special based on the album, which is kind of telling this little fairy tale. As he once put it, it was one extended pun of it was a place called The Point, and everything there had a point to it, and all the people had pointed heads, and this. Until there was this little boy named Oblio who's born, and he's got a round head, and it's like he doesn't fit in, and it's lots of plays on words. Is point of view, you've got a point there, point of sale, and it's kind of fun, and there was this animated special, as I said, made of this. There's three different versions with regards to who does the narration. The original narration was done by Dustin Hoffman, who was the star, or one of the stars of Midnight Cowboy. Did it as a favor, but with the understanding that his voice wouldn't be used in any sort of future use of it. The second version is the one that I have, which is his good friend Ringo Starr doing the narration. And there's a later version in the 80s with, of all people, Alan Thicke doing it, but I like the Ringo Starr version. Animated special, just telling this story. It's a sweet little thing for kids, but a little bit of darkness, and I think kids can handle that. Also, he did something quite unusual, which is this one here, Aerial Pandemonium Ballet, which is he's takes songs from his first two albums and remixes them and does alternate takes. And it's like the first real remix album that anybody had ever done. Kind of changes the sound, a little fresh perspective. Kind of taking advantage of his newer fame to bring some attention to his older material. It's about at that point that he came up with the biggest album that he ever made, which is Nilsson Schmilsson. Let me just bring that up. That's a classic album cover. Hang on for a second here. Fascinating, I know. Here we go. Nilsson Schmilsson. And this is the one that had a lot of big hits on it. This is collaboration with Richard Perry. That's one that has Gotta Get Up on it, has Coconut. Another big song on that one, awesome song, is Jump Into the Fire, which is a part of the soundtrack to the movie Goodfellas. Later on, they used the song, but it's this amazing, real kind of awesome song. Got a great drum solo in it from the late Jim Gordon. It's a classic. If you hear it, it makes you want to jump up and down. It's a great one. This would won, I believe, at least one, possibly more Grammys. It was nominated for a lot of them, and he's the high watermark for his commercial success. Probably pretty much the high watermark for his artistic success, because unfortunately, at this point, things started to derail with Harry Nilsson. A lot of people suggesting, he went through a divorce at the time from his second wife. Some people suggest he had a death wish. He definitely seemed to have a certain amount of self-sabotage creeping in. His next album was called Son of Schmilsson, and that was a little bit of a weirder album. It's a good album. I like it a lot, but to the frustration of his producer and the record label, the closest thing to a single on it had, of course, "You're breaking my heart, you're tearing it apart, so F you." I'm censoring the word. I'm not afraid to say that word, but I'm trying to keep my podcast clean and presentable. But obviously, you couldn't really get that on the radio back then or now. But it's a bit of frustration. It's like, they're thinking, wow, we can have this big successful career after this, and he's kind of going down a weird path. And that's what an artist has to follow their muse. But I can imagine what the record company was thinking at that point. The next album was called A Touch of Schmilsson in the Night, and again, it's like going down a tangent, it's a beautiful album of kind of more standards. I think as time goes by on that one, I won't look that up, but there's a lot of beautiful songs on it. But there's sort of cold classic jazz and American songbook standards. Again, he's kind of ahead of his time, because later on, lots of people would just go to that, like Bears Through Jar of Honey. I know Rod Stewart did several albums of that, but he was the one person doing it. But not a big, commercial, super commercial prospect to do that at the time. But he did it, and he did a beautiful job. Now, the next album after that, Pussycats, that was produced by John Lennon's kind of collaboration with them, and you think, oh wow, meeting of giants. But while I do like it, it's not a particularly strong album at this point. He and John Lennon are drinking buddies. This is when John Lennon was having his notorious Lost Weekend. There's an infamous incident where they were at a club where the Smothers Brothers, the comedy duo, were trying to have a comeback show, and John Lennon and Harry Nilsson were there, and they were very, very drunk. Sorry for scratching my face there. Very, very drunk, and just loudly and crudely heckling them. And John Lennon wound up being dragged out of it. But this sort of, I gather Mr. Nilsson was rather kind of goading him on with regards to that. And May Pang, who was John Lennon's companion at the time, was just saying, trying to get him to cut it out, and that wouldn't happen. And they were getting wild, and they were getting very rowdy, and the album's good, but it's kind of messy. And unfortunately, yeah, one thing I see in notes here is Hollywood Vampires. Yeah, there was a group of drinking buddies known as the Hollywood Vampires, and John Lennon. There was John Lennon and Harry Nilsson, and also Ringo Starr and Keith Moon. There's this kind of odd little picture there, that sort of, where four of these them was Nilsson and Lennon, and Alice Cooper and Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees, and right in the middle is Canada's snowbird herself, the beloved Anne Murray. It's like, this is okay. That's an odd pairing. I mean, she's Nova Scotia lass. I'm sure she could handle her ale. But I was kind of wondering what she made of these kind of lunatics getting drunk around them. But unfortunately, at this point, Harry Nilsson's voice kind of blows out in full-on screaming matches with John Lennon. And that was a real shame. Harry Nilsson, in his prime, had one of the most beautiful voices imaginable. It was like so much nuance, a beautiful range, just velvety touch. It was like perfect. And then it gets pretty ragged around here. I believe that he did have an actual throat aneurysm. I'm not sure if I've got the right terminology, but he blew out his throat. And wasn't really taking care of it. And a lot of smoking, a lot of whiskey, a lot of other things, and it's not helping. So the voice is a bit ragged on that. It's also a bit ragged on the next album. Still shaky on the next one. Called "Do It on Monday," and then there's the next few albums after that. He's recovered a bit. His voice is a bit more in shape. They're nice. They're nice albums. They're good ones. They're not classics by any range, but I still find them interesting. But then there's the record company kind of like realizing is not really a viable commercial prospect at this point, and he'd signed a long contract backed up by John Lennon, so they bought him out, and it was a chunk of change in his pocket at the same time. It's not the greatest thing. He put out one more album, which I still haven't heard of, called Flash Harry. It was the end of the 70s, and that was basically it as a full-time recording career. He did work on the Robin Williams movie Popeye. He and Van Dyke Parks put together the score and the soundtrack for it. Wrote all the songs for it. But that's sort of one of the last efforts. In 1980, John Lennon was murdered. He's a very good friend, and he, that took a very heavy toll on him. He spent much of the next decade campaigning for handgun control, which is Widow Una mentioned. It's like, it's a bit of a shame because it doesn't seem like handgun laws are really changed that much since then. In spite of his efforts trying to bring down handgun violence. I'll leave the political talk to others, but that was his focus for the next while. It was the last song that the last song that I think he recorded and was released that I can think of while he lived was a version of How About You? I like New York in June. How about you? Which he did for the soundtrack to the movie The Fisher King. And that was pretty much the last effort that he did that was released. He had a kind of a rough ride, very up and down. He had some health problems. He had congenital health problems. He wound up having a substantial heart attack towards the end of his life. Before he wound up dying of a heart attack, but he had one before that, and so he was on shaky ground after that. Also, he had financial misfortune. His accountant and pretty much embezzled all that he had and left him and his family destitute. He was kind of scrambling towards the end to put back together his life financially because he wanted to support his family, which is part of the good part of things going on though, because his first two marriages didn't work out, but in the late '70s he met a woman named Una who became his third Irish woman who was his third wife, and from all accounts she was the love of his life. They had 6 kids. They had was very devoted to his family, and in that he did manage to achieve a level of great happiness. Yeah, it was in 1994 he had his last heart attack, his second one, from which he died, and that sadly put an end to his life. He was trying to record one last album. I think he knew it was his last album at the time, which was later released, and it's this one here, Lost and Found. And it's a really fun album. Again, I'm not going to say, I'm not going to call it the greatest album that he ever put out, but I enjoy it. I'm glad I had, and glad he managed to get that out. And the story is that about, I think it was the day of his funeral, there was a very, very heavy earthquake in California, and some of his friends joked that was Harry arriving in heaven and finding out the bars were closed. So it was a little bit of, had a little bit of dark humor that they threw in. It was appropriate to the man himself. Again, I will mention, as I won't show it again, but that documentary was made, and it helped raise his profile a bit. It has pretty much just a murderer's row of great American songwriters and composers from the 60s and 70s. As I mentioned before, Van Dyke Parks, Randy Newman, Brian Wilson, Jimmy Webb, Paul Williams. Burt Bacharach doesn't appear. Presumably, I guess he was like having his teeth cleaned or something at the time. But it was a fair amount of these amazing, great legendary songwriters of this time period are there to sing their praises of Harry Nilsson. And there's a lot of affection that goes into it. There's a lot of humor in it. And he was a funny guy. Maybe that's what eventually drew me to him. I'm surprised I resisted him so before, but humor will frequently bring me into an artist. If they're funny, I'll like them. There's a good chance, at least, that I'll like them. One thing I haven't really touched on is a very, I mentioned his voice, but he's a very, very gifted songwriter. His songs are charming. There's a quirkiness to them. There's a lot of whimsy. He could do rock. He could do kind of more pop songs. Did ballads. There's just endless invention of the songs. It's just, I was mentioning this box set before. I'll wave it in front of the cameras again. Yeah, so it's the Nilsson RCA albums collection. I think most, if not all, of the individual albums on it have extra tracks, and there's 3 discs of extra things as well on it. It's just a wealth of good stuff. So yeah, Harry Nilsson, came to him late, but I've utterly fallen in love with his work, and I hope you if you haven't tried him before, again, I always say take a chance, check him out. And so hopefully that's it for Mr. Nilsson, and I will be back hopefully not too long with the letter O. Good night.